You're supposed to clap there. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's an honor to be here as well, and thank you all for coming out, and thanks David Salisbury for that very gracious introduction, and I thank the University of Richmond and all the various programs for inviting me here tonight. Thank you. Tonight I'm going to take you deep into the Amazon, into the land where far from our shopping malls and prepackaged food and media-saturated environment, I'm going to take you into land where there are no such things and where people have no knowledge of the existence of Jesus Christ or Christopher Columbus or Osama bin Laden, where they continue to live a life much like we lived for 99% of our history and prehistory until the modern era. Incredibly, there are still these communities living in near isolation from the rest of the world, deep in the Amazon, and they invite us to think about where we came from and to imagine a different way of life, different from the one we are living. Somebody asked me one day, and you know, by the way, the mission that I accompanied this the journey I'm going to take you on tonight into the land of one such tribe, the people of the Arrow. And somebody asked me, well, how could you write a book about a people that you never met? And I said, yeah, that's pretty difficult. That's why the book's only 3 pages long. But anyway, I'm going to take you there tonight. And these communities, you know, for example, this is a community in Peru. This last one is a Yanomami community, still uncontracted by the outside world. These are a group of Mashco-Piro Indians on a riverbank in Peru. What must these people be thinking about the airplane that's going past them? What could they possibly imagine that it is? That is one of the things that I find so incredibly fascinating about this story and the continued existence of these people now in the third millennium. What we know about uncontracted tribes in the Amazon, much of what we know, we owe this person. This is an incredible man, Sidney Pozuelo. My journey and my whole association with him came about as a result of a phone call from the National Geographic. They wanted to know if I was available to head off into the Amazon to write a profile about this man, Sidney Pozuelo. Pozuelo comes out of a 100-year-old tradition in Brazil of wilderness scouts who had ventured deep into the Amazon in order to make contact with the so-called wild tribes in the forest in order to integrate them into the national society. This began largely with a man named Cândido Rondon back 100 years ago. He's actually the founder of the Indian Protection Service in Brazil. And back in the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, Rondon had the task of, he was a colonel in the army, and he was charged with going deep into the jungle to lay strategic telegraph lines that would link the most remote reaches of the Brazilian nation with the metropolitan areas on the Atlantic coast of Brazil, Rio and Sao Paulo. So Rondon went deep into the forest, went on several expeditions to lay telegraph line into the forest, and in the course of doing that, he came in contact with several previously uncontacted indigenous societies. And in the course of making those contacts, Rondon became firmly convinced that the Indians that he was meeting in the deep jungle were not only the rightful owners of the land where they lived, but also the most tenacious guardians of the rainforest. And he believed that, but he was a positivist, and he had a view that everyone could succeed and progress if given an equal chance. So his philosophy was make contact with these groups, integrate them into the national society on equal footing with the rest of the country, and then people would prosper. What in fact happened was the Indians would invariably end up on the lowest rungs of the society, Brazilian society. Many would die off immediately from the introduction of germs to which they had no immunity. In fact, the isolated tribes of the Amazon today are still as defenseless to the microbes that we carry, microbes that evolved in the course of millennia on the Eurasian landmass. Influenza, measles, even the common cold can be fatal to these unexposed so-called virgin soil populations. And in fact, Pozuelo, midway through his career, so after Rondon came another couple of generations of these agents of contact. They're called in Brazilian Portuguese sertanistas. The sertanistas derives from the Brazilian word sertão, which is essentially the bush, the backwoods. So these were backwoodsmen. And Pozuelo came out of this 100-year tradition, and he, in the course of his early career, notched 7 first contacts with different tribes that he was charged with making contact with. And in the course of doing this, as I said before, he saw, the first thing that he saw was these tribes would begin to die off massively shortly after exposure to these outside microbes. Mortality would typically run from 50 to 90% of a tribe within a couple of years. And so first you'd have this massive die-off, this demographic shock that would be followed by rapid cultural disintegration. And then the Indians would essentially lose their will to defend their lands. Their lands would be easily overrun. And essentially what would happen in the end was, despite the peaceful and benevolent intentions, the end result would be much like a violent massacre. The Indians would be mostly wiped out. They'd be reduced to living in a small corner of their land, which had been overrun by others. And for Pozuelo, contact, whether peaceful or violent, was a losing proposition for the indigenous people of Brazil. So he pioneered a new policy midway through his career. The Sertanistas and Brazil's Indian Affairs Agency would no longer go out into the bush to contact these last groups of so-called wild Indians, but would rather simply identify where they lived. They tried to ascertain the extent of their lands and then protect that land and keep outsiders from going in. Extraordinary change in policy, revolutionary in many ways if you think about it. And so National Geographic was interested in a profile about Pozuelo, but in order to do this profile, Pozuelo was just about to embark on an open-ended journey into one of the deepest redoubts of the Amazon in order to identify the dimensions of the land as I described to you. He was on his way into the deep Amazon, and if I wanted to do the profile of Pozuelo, I was going to have to go along with him on this journey deep into the Amazon. Pozuelo was about to depart on an expedition into this area you see shaded here. This is the Jabari Valley indigenous land. This is in the far western corner of Brazil, a territory laced with rivers and dense upland forest, and about essentially the size of Florida, 33,000 square miles, not a single road, not a single airstrip, completely wild. Also happens to be the home to the densest concentration of uncontacted tribes anywhere in the Amazon and hence in the world, because the vast preponderance of uncontacted indigenous communities that remain in the world today are in the Amazon. And in this area in particular, in the Jaguar Valley, they are the work of Pozuelo's department. By the way, when Pozuelo led the sea change in the policy, a new entity was created, the curiously named Department of Isolated Indians. The Department of Isolated Indians has jurisdiction over these areas where uncontacted groups are are known to exist. And in this area, the Jabari Valley, there are 18 uncontacted indigenous communities, and divided into at least 8 uncontacted tribes just in this area, the highest concentration in the world, the Jabari Valley in far western Brazil. But and Pozuelo's objective in this journey, we were going to be interested in one group in particular, a group known as the Flecheiros, or the people of the arrow, who inhabit a number of these clearings, who live in communities in this dense forest in the southern reaches of the Jabari Valley. By the way, all these white crosses you see on the map are the approximate locations of uncontacted indigenous settlements. So this expedition would unfold in a number of different phases, starting with riverboats. We were heading upriver, up the Itaquai River. I don't know why I don't have any sound here. Did the sound go off after?
It's there, isn't it? You should turn it up.
Did I do something with the sound panel when I leaned on that thing over there? Anyway, we're going upriver on this series of boats on this flotilla. The expedition was timed to coincide with the end of the rainy season, so that we would get maximum penetration into the rainforest. As in the far western Amazon, the water levels fluctuate up to 40 feet from the height of the rainy season to the dry season. The water level can fluctuate up to 40 feet. And so the expedition was timed to coincide with the end of the rainy season. We get deep into the forest on these boats, and then the water would be going down as we were to begin our overland trek, which would come later. And as we go, the expedition departed from Tabatinga, right on the border of Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. And as we go up the south, upriver, up this river, the Itaquai River, we're passing directly into the land where a couple of different uncontacted tribes are out in the forest. To the west, actually to our right, as we're going upriver, are the Headbashers. These are Carubo Indians with clubs who attack unsuspecting intruders with their, delivering skull-shattering blows with their clubs. And on the left side of the river are the Arrow people, the tribe whose lands we are going to cross, and they defend their territory with showers of deadly arrows. So we're threading the needle between the Headbashers on the one side of the river and the Arrow people on the other. And as we go upriver, we're passing through a number of Connemara Indian settlements. This is what the Connemara looked like. This was a caiman that was awaiting butchering for breakfast one morning. And as we went upriver, Pozuelo was actually recruiting indigenous scouts to our journey. By the time we left the last Connemara settlement, he had put together an expedition of 34 men, including Indians from 3 friendly, contacted tribes, including the Connemara. We had 2 scouts from the Marubo tribe, these 2 guys, and then the most colorful, the Métis. There were 12 Métis with us who represented the single largest ethnicity in our 34-man team. We also had 10 like mixed-blooded, culturally considered branco or whites in Brazilian, mixed-blooded mestizos, backwoodsmen. So as I said, by the time we left the last Connemara village, Pozuelo had put together this 34-member expedition, much like a Lewis and Clark style expedition. As I said, there were 3 different indigenous groups represented in the expedition, and all told 34 members. Part of his calculus was he wanted, first of all, a large number of people. The Arrow people is a tribe about which almost nothing is known. We don't know what they call themselves. They are called the Arrow people because they have a reputation for repelling all intrusions into their land with, showers of arrows. Nobody knows exactly actually what they call themselves nor what ethnicity they belong to. Almost nothing is known about them. What language they speak, that's an unknown. And so Pozuelo wanted to have a wide range of indigenous languages represented in the expedition in the event of an inadvertent contact. He also wanted them to see that we were a large contingent because the Arrow people have in the past invariably repelled all intrusions into their land with their arrows. And so Pozuelo was applying kind of a twist on the doctrine of overwhelming force. Let them see that we are many, and let them see that we are well armed, because all of the men on the expedition, except me and the other, and the photographer for the Geographic, were armed with highly visible rifles. As the water level dropped, as I explained before, those larger boats that you saw could no longer go. We had reached a place where the river was too shallow. The water level's beginning to drop. We're also going further upstream, and so now we transfer to these boats that we had been trailing, and the larger boats, these shallow draft skiffs. And as we go upriver, unfortunately the soundtrack has dropped away here. As we go upriver, we are crossing into completely wild Amazon. We've crossed beyond the last of the Connemara villages. The Connemara themselves say, it's wild up there. They're wild Indians. We don't go up there, and so anyway. But as I said before, now I'm getting, what's going on? It's you? Am I good? Okay. So anyway, as I was saying, all right, we get a little sound here. Okay, so as I was saying, as we're going upriver, we've crossed over into the completely wild Amazon, and the clearest indication that we're actually breaching this barrier and entering a completely wild area are these trees, and we had to cut our way through dozens of them to get upstream. And a lot of these trees had been, you could tell that they'd been there for years and years and years, so nobody had gone up this river. Even the Connemara and the villages that we were leaving behind were like, we don't go up there. There are wild Indians up there. That's their land. It's dangerous. We don't go. And that's where we were going. So we're cutting through these trees, getting deeper and deeper into this completely wild area. Another indication that we were, now in like real wilderness were these fresh Jaguar Prints on the beach. And now we reached a point where even those shallow draft skiffs that you saw could no longer penetrate any further upriver. At that point, those boats were left behind, And in fact, they turned around and went back because we're about to embark on an disembark on an overland journey from which there would be no immediate return anyway. We were not going to come back the same way we went. And so over the course of the next 3 weeks, we now undertake this grueling overland trek through this heavily forested headwaters region right into the land of the Arrow people. And as we enter this forest, we begin to see just how rugged the terrain is. It's crisscrossed by rivers, streams. We have to cross. There are 15, 16 of these crossings every day, balancing, walking across these very slippery logs, sometimes a 10, sometimes 20, 30-foot drop to the water below, not knowing how deep the water is or what you might encounter if you happen to fall. There's nothing like that kind of situation. Knowing also there was absolutely no possibility of an evacuation. The nearest helicopter is about 1,000 miles away. We'd never be able to get word out in any case because the forest canopy is so dense. The satellite phones won't work, the radio won't work, so we're completely cut off from the outside world. So there's nothing like those circumstances to kind of focus your concentration as you start out over these log bridges. And you can see just how sure of foot I felt, as I was crossing one of the earlier ones here. And also this area that we're entering, the water is just seeping up out of the ground and collecting in pools and running into small streams and into larger creeks like this one. This water is so pure you can just dip your cup in it and drink it, which is what we were doing. This is really dense jungle that and completely virgin wilderness. So our lead scouts are actually hacking open the jungle with their machetes, and we're following in a single file through this dense jungle. There can be maybe as much as a mile and a half separating the lead scouts who are hacking open the trailhead from the stragglers at the very end. We're spread out through this jungle all the way along, and we're finding the going extremely difficult. There are days when we're not able to advance any more than like 2.5, 3 kilometers in a day on the map. That's how rugged the terrain is. We're going through swamplands, up and down steep gullies and hillsides. This turns out to be an area where 4 separate rivers are born, and we are crossing the divide between those 4 rivers, following ridge lines and plunging down into gullies and then up steep embankments on the other side. And as we enter this land, and there's a hazard literally at every step. Fire ants swarming in the trees, snakes, virgulances, bushmasters, some of the most deadly snakes you can imagine, trees swarming with fire ants. And the incredible thing is that, if we had been walking along an established trail, that would have been hard enough, but this was sheer bushwhacking. We were following Pozuelo's compass. He would look at the compass and he'd point the way forward. Now, what we're trying to do is ascertain the dimensions of the land of the Arrow people without actually making contact with them. So that's what, as we're going here, we're traversing this land on the lookout for signs that there are human beings living in this jungle. As we go, through this, and the humidity is probably like 99%. It feels like we're walking through a vast terrarium. And the sun is barely penetrating the forest canopy, even though we're like only 2 degrees off the equator. And you have this direct sun coming down at noon. Only like 3% of the sunlight manages to filter down through the canopy to the forest floor. And in the middle of the day, it was amazing. So the sun would come down in shades of green and yellow from way up there, but down here was like really dark. And we come to places where where mysteriously there was like no undergrowth whatsoever. It was just like a leaf litter on the forest floor, and these enormous trees that would soar like Roman columns off the jungle floor, soar up into the canopy. And in the stillness of the jungle during, like around midday, falls completely silent. In the morning and night, it's raucous. There, cicadas and frogs and monkeys, but in the middle of the day, it's like really still, really quiet. And so in that midday, when there's like that stillness and the sun coming down, filtering down like that, it felt like you were walking on the bottom of the ocean. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon or so, we'd invariably stop to make camp. You can see me here having a great time trying to erect my shelter for the evening. There was an amazing division of labor. Some people were assigned to set up the campsite. Others would be sent off to hunt for the evening meal. This would be like a typical jungle bivouac. There were, in the course of this journey, like 40 separate campsites like this one. And as I said, some of our men were dispatched to hunt. There was a period of the first week to 10 days of the trek. The only game they could find in the forest were monkeys. And so it was pretty grim. In fact, the task of dismembering those animals and preparing them for the evening meals fell to these two guys. These were our cooks, Mauro on the left and Paulo Sosa on the right. And Mauro was particularly affected by this, the task that he was called upon to perform. About the 5th night of our jaunt, of our trek in the forest, all of us were awakened at 3 in the morning by these blood-curdling shrieks. I mean, it was chilling. And then, the next morning, as he's ladling my coffee, Mauro takes me aside, this sort of relentlessly macho culture of the expedition. He didn't want to confess this to everyone, but he took me aside and said, "Senor Scotch," that's what they called me, Scotch, or Scotchy. "Senor Scotch, it was terrible. In the night, I had this nightmare. The monkeys, they came at me with a knife, with my knife, and they pinned me against a tree, and they went to castrate me." And that's when I woke up. Anyway, so this this sort of mood kind of infected all of us. And by the way, and as this diet of monkey meat sort of went from one day to another, this was me in the course of going, on that diet, from looking like this to looking like that. 35 pounds I lost on this trip. Unfortunately, I've put just about all of it back on. Need to get back out there on the Amazon diet again. So anyway, but as we penetrate this forest, we begin to find, not only are there monkeys and incredible creatures there, but we do begin to discover signs that this is indeed inhabited by human beings. We are not in an empty forest by any stretch of the imagination, neither in terms of wildlife nor in terms of human beings. We come upon abandoned fishing camps, lean-tos. In this location, they left behind a ceramic pot, perfectly crafted ceramic pot. In another location, we found this tapir jaw left in the cleft of a tree, perhaps some kind of totem. But as we discovered these, they call them vestigios, vestiges. As we discovered these vestiges, our scouts would date them. They were experts, and Pozuelo was pretty good at it too, and our indigenous scouts were amazing. They would look at, an abandoned fishing camp and they'd say, "Oh, this is from 2 months ago." Or they'd see some snapped twigs broken off. Forest people, when they move through the forest, instinctively snap green, the branches, the low-hanging branches as they walk, kind of leaving a trail like breadcrumbs to find their way back. And these quebradas, they're called, Our scouts could tell from the greenness of the wood, or how much time it had taken to for the bark to grow back over them. They could date these things, and there was always a presumption from the time that they had been left behind. There was always a presumption of relative safety in terms of distance. This is from 2 months ago, 2 weeks ago. This is maybe like a week old. Till one day, 3 weeks now after we had left the boats behind, bushwhacking through this very dense, very trying, very difficult jungle. We had all been losing lots of weight. We were sick. We were tired. 3 weeks into this journey on the river, 6 weeks since I had arrived in Brazil, this indigenous scout, Ivan Arapa, suddenly freezes, and he points down at a footprint at his feet, and he said, "This is from right now." And sure enough, just ahead in the forest, we could hear people talking excitedly, and Pozuelo said, "Quick, give me a Conor Murray, give me a Matisse Marubo, come up here, shout in the forest, tell them we mean them no harm, we're here peacefully, don't be afraid of us." And so one by one, the Matisse would shout into the forest, and then the Conor Murray shouted into the forest, and then the Marubo, and there was no answer. And then, amazingly, despite the fact that our mission is to not make contact with the Yarrow people, for all the reasons that I've described, the epidemic diseases, the cultural dislocation, all these negative consequences, suddenly, in the excitement of the moment and the desire to catch a glimpse of these people, suddenly our column just breaks, and everyone starts running in the direction of where these voices are coming from. And so, at this point, so we're running in the direction of where these voices come from, and at a certain point, some of our scouts go left, and some go straight, and I had to decide which way to go. And Pozuelo had gone straight, so I stayed on his heels, and it was the wrong choice. Because like a minute later, there were shouts from a couple hundred yards off to the left, over here, they're crossing the river. And so by the time we got there, we got to this place where a large tree had fallen across this pretty broad river. It was maybe 30, 40 feet across, and a tree had fallen across it, and another one had fallen across from the opposite side. And actually it was wider than that. It was 30 yards probably. A tree had fallen this way. Another tree had fallen this way, and where they met, there was a bridge that had formed, and you could see that it was a place of regular transit for the Yarrow people, because from the branches that that rose up from these prostrate logs, they had strung vine as a handrail. And so our two guys were like, "We saw them, two of them. They dashed across the bridge, disappeared across the woods, across the river, into the forest there." And so, at this point, Pozuelo orders these pots to be strung here as a peace offering to the Indians. This is right at the point where this tree had fallen across the river. He said, "Let's shine up some pots, leave them here. It would be our way of saying thank you to them for using the trailhead." Now, interestingly, traditionally, a Sertanista like Pozuelo would use this kind of technique to woo the Indians from the forest. They would go deep into the forest and maybe set up for weeks or months or even years at a time, and just shower the Indians with gifts like these, machetes, pots, mirrors, what have you, and induce them into taking them, and eventually into taking a handshake. And that's how contact in the history of Brazil was typically made with the wild Indians, so-called wild Indians. And so he's using the same techniques, traditional techniques of the Sertanista, but in this case, it's not to make contact with the Indians. It's simply to let them know that we are on a peaceful mission and we don't intend to do them harm. But now the clock is ticking, because we know that they know that we're in their land. And so, with this reputation that they have for, repelling all intrusions into their territory, what are they going to do? Are they going to attack us? Is word going to spread, through, and most likely and definitely is going to spread through the entire realm of the Arrow people? They have many different communities, and so now the fear is like they could begin massing forces for an attack. At this point, I take you back to the river for 1 second to introduce you to these two, Conemarie, Wilson, the one in the foreground, and Alfredo on the left. And that's Alfredo there. 3 days after that encounter at the bridge, 3 days later, we start out, and pretty shortly into our trek, we come upon a well-worn footpath going through the jungle. It was like the Appalachian Trail, like amazing footpath leading back through the jungle. After bushwhacking for 3 weeks to find this trail in the midst of, in the middle of the wilderness. And so Pozuelo read his compass and said, oh, well, it's going in the same direction we want to go in. Let's give ourselves a break here and follow it for a little while. So we start clipping along this footpath, and it felt like, I-95 after what we've been through. And we had been clipping along for about 15 minutes when suddenly we came to a sapling, a small tree that had been kind of crudely hacked about 3 feet out from the bottom and laid by a shred of bark across the path. And Pozuelo pulls up short and goes, whoa, this is universal language in the jungle. This means stay out, go no further. We must be getting near their village. So he orders us off the trail at a right angle, and we go back into, the boot-sucking mud and the branches swarming with fire ants, and so we're back in full jungle again, and we go about half an hour and reach the banks of a Clearwater Creek, and Pozuelo says, let's stop here and wait for the others to catch up. I told you that we're moving through the jungle in this single file, so it can take quite a while for everyone to catch up. And so we're sprawled out on the forest floor. Guys are coming in groups of 2s and 3s, staggering under their loads, dropping to the ground. And we'd been there about an hour, and everyone had been accounted for except Wilson and Alfredo. So Pozuelo goes, you, dispatches a search party. Oh, you guys, go out and find those idiots. So he sends, the first search party out, and we're waiting there for like a half an hour, and they don't come back. So Pozuelo, staring at his, looking at his wristwatch, brooding, getting really, really mad. He goes, you guys, go out there, go find those guys. So, and those guys don't come back. And so now this whole calculus of, having overwhelming, superiority is kind of, disintegrated. Now we've splintered into, 4 different groups in the middle of, nowhere, in the heart of, so-called hostile territory. And so eventually the first scouts come back, and they report that at that roadblock, the footprints of our companions, they were wearing these very distinctive tennis shoes that Pozuelo had outfitted the entire expedition with. Their footprints led right through that gate, which they completely ignored, and then carried down the path. And the path led through an enormous garden where they had under cultivation manioc, bananas, sugarcane. And then the path led straight into a village with 14 large thatched huts. The people had evidently bolted moments before. They left smoldering campfires, piles of meat, all 5 different species of monkey, tapir, tortoise eggs, and bowls filled with uruku dye, red dye, which is the red body paint that Amazonian tribes paint their bodies and faces with for ceremonies and so on. And There were also 2 large vats of curare, which is the poison that they slather on their arrow tips to make them deadly. And so, evidently, Pozuelo was like, yeah, they couldn't run with those, so they left them behind. They tried to hide them. They put leaves over them. So that was, particularly ominous, but most ominous of all was the tracks of our 2 companions led out the far side of the village and started down a path, and they just vanished. The footprints were there, and the next thing we knew, they were gone. So, the assumption was that they had been yanked off their feet, dragged into the forest, killed, abducted, whatever. So at this point, we start a double-time march through the forest. Pozuelo says, we can't stay here. He looks around. It's like this incredibly closed forest. You can't see more than 30 feet or less in any direction. He goes, this is a death trap here. They could, wipe us out here. We're moving to another spot. By the way, another thing I should say about the Indian Protection Service, the guiding philosophy, starting with Rondon, is, and continues to this day, die if you must, but never kill. And so the standing orders on our expedition were, if fired upon, if attacked by the Arrow people, the standing orders were return fire only in the air, shoot warning shots in the air only, never directly at the Arrow people. And so when Pozuelo saw this very difficult situation developing, so he said, we got to get out of here. So we started double timing through the forest, and we came to this very another sort of ominous sign. The Arrow people, this is one of their primitive canoes fashioned from a couple of hollow palm trunks lashed together with vine, and they had actually leapfrogged ahead of us. And there were fresh footprints there by the side of the river, so they were not only behind us, but they were in front of us now as well. And now we continued double timing for about 3 days to this location in the forest which would come to be called the main camp. This is almost semi-permanent installations, and now, as I said before, the plan from the very beginning was we weren't going to go back the same way we came in. Far too dangerous. So out in the middle of the wilderness, the plan, as originally called for, would be we were going to build from scratch in the middle of the wilderness 2 enormous dugout canoes that would be our ticket out of the wilderness. And so, by the way, those power tools, the chainsaws you saw earlier in the trip, those went back with those little boats that we left behind. And so we proceeded through the forest only with these hand tools. So now, in the middle of the wilderness, using only axes, and those are called adzes. If you've never seen an adze, that's what it looks like. A scooping tool. They built, our men, in the course of 2 weeks, built these enormous dugout canoes, and then hollowed them out. Even the paddles were hand carved. Meanwhile, we were enjoying the bounty of the forest, including this deer. And anybody know what those are? Piranhas. And the occasional minuscule catfish. The ancient art of making a dugout canoe, I never would have imagined this, but it's not enough just to hollow out a trunk. In order to actually make it like water worthy, the hull has to be pried open. So, it's a C shape when you just hollow out a trunk, but then they use fire to make the wood super hot and malleable, and then the hull is pried open in order to create a true canoe. So that's what they're doing here. And if you see that, everything they're using is are instruments that they built in the jungle. These incredible instruments they're using to pry open the hull. So anyway,
Then we had to get the canoes to the river because they were each site where the canoes were built was like, 500, 600 yards from the river. So we had to build these roads through the forest to get the trees to the river. One of the canoes was built behind the main camp, so it came right through the main camp to be launched. And then 2 weeks after stopping in this location, now all of a sudden we have these 2 canoes ready for our departure, and now we're leaving the main camp behind forever and continuing the next phase of our journey in the canoes down the Jutai River. The river we came up a month and a half before, almost 2 months earlier now, was the Itaquai, and now we're going to go down the Jutai, a completely different river, and that's our campsite that we're leaving behind. And that Pozuelo said for sure the Arrow people were in immediately after we departed to examine everything, and perhaps they even relocated their village to that location. We don't know. So now we now proceed downriver. This was 12 more days, rowing 12 hours a day. Those are the newly launched canoes on the river. We had spent nearly 2 months in the gloom of the forest canopy, and now we were exposed to blistering sun and frequent downpours on the river. You can appreciate those incredible paddles that they constructed. And this is fog in the early morning. In the western Amazon, it's very rare that you actually see a sunrise because there's always mist on the rivers. It's not, and it doesn't usually burn off until like 8:30 or 9 in the morning. So this is early in the morning heading downriver. Again, this is in Brazil they call these pirarucu, very ancient fish, delicious. You can appreciate so the Matisse canoe, the ones that they built, had this canopy in the middle where we stowed our gear. And now we finally got to a place downriver that was deep enough for a motorboat to come extract us. And that boat ride returned us to the expedition starting point nearly 3 months later, 2,500 miles later, brought us back to the start of our expedition. And with that, I'll take some questions. Thank you very much.